Thanks, Seamus, and thanks everybody for the invite. So I guess to be clear at the start, whilst this is a cancer meeting, our remit is really to look at trials across the entire spectrum of health, and I'm going to try and pick out some of the things that may be more relevant to cancer. These are my disclosures. You know, we hear a lot about, I guess, the Irish clinical trials landscape, and I'm going to show you some data on that at the moment, but we do have a lot of very well-established areas within Ireland that could set us up to be an excellent destination for clinical trials. And this is an enormous global market, getting bigger and bigger, and so it's not only, I guess, an issue around how we provide access to new therapeutics, whether they be drugs, cellular therapeutics, surgery, radiation, but also it's how we fund our health service going forward, because we're missing out on huge revenue for, I suppose, particularly in the area of commercial trials. And I would say that if we can build up a proper infrastructure for clinical trial activity across all diseases, this will allow us then to develop the academic trials that many of us are slightly more interested in. Our remit has really been around commercial trials, but a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk to today will obviously improve those of us that run academic investigator-initiated studies also. So it's very important to kind of get this clear at the start. Like James O'Shaughnessy, who did a similar piece of work in the UK, gave me one piece of advice. He said, make sure you define a clinical trial at the start. If you're going to measure anything, we need to know what we're going to measure at the start. So we've taken very clearly the definition of a clinical trial from the CTR, and that may be considered quite narrow in spectrum, but one of our key areas that we need to look at is we need to measure what is success, and we need to measure that in terms of data, so therefore we need to know what goes in the first place. Now, if you look at where we stand at the moment, we're doing very poorly across the whole spectrum of health. This is data from ICON, who are members of the NCTOG, and you can see that really less than 1% of clinical trials that are available are actually opened in Ireland at the moment. And you could consider that a terrible travesty, or you could consider it an opportunity. And those of you who know me know I'm mostly, I suppose, an optimistic person, so I see this as an opportunity because we can do so much better so quickly. And you all know, and the people in this room are very clear about that one of the single greatest barriers is time to initiation. So our ability to open trials is really curtailed oftentimes by bureaucracy, contract, data protection, issues that are boring in some ways, but actually if we don't fix those first, we can't do anything else. So I kind of see my role here as building the foundations for a house that we're going to build, and I'm not an interior designer, but I expect that somebody will come in as the interior designer in the future and make it look nice and shiny and glossy. One of the things I would say about time from, I suppose, regulatory approval to initiation or first patient on study is that it's not all about speed. Predictability is just as important to the commercial partners. So you'll see there on the Netherlands are just as slow as us in getting trials opened, but they're predictable. And that predictability is key. So people know if I submit my application in the Netherlands, it might take me 10 to 12 months, but 95% of my studies will go through in that time. And that predictability may be just as important as speed. So the purpose of the group, which was established by the Minister of Health, Stephen Donnelly, in July of 2024, are outlined here. And really, I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but it's about developing an ecosystem that we can actually become an efficient, lean destination for clinical trials. And really it's about making Ireland a destination for clinical trial activity. And I think Avril mentioned Denmark earlier. Well, the reason Denmark are successful is because it's actually a policy across the board in government to make it a destination for clinical trials, even within their life sciences strategy. Also, obviously, I suppose, helped by one of the largest companies in the world sitting on your doorstep. But I guess what you can see is when we really look at this, why would we do it? Well, we do it because we inherently believe, and we have to be a little bit biased when we say that by performing clinical trials, you will improve clinical outcomes. and that patients who are treated in research active institutions, whether they be hospitals, community care facilities, GP practices, have better outcomes than patients that are treated in non-research active institutions. And that's really the basis of where I suppose I'm coming from this perspective. These are our objectives, and again, I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but it was really around looking at the obstacles and the barriers that were curtailing both patients, healthcare providers, and sponsors in coming to Ireland to perform studies, and then to identify maybe Ireland's unique selling point, and then to come up with a set of recommendations that would allow us to streamline the process, but also future-proof the process, that we would have proper workforce planning in place, that we would have proper cost recovery plannings in place, and that we would actually recommend, a long-term, durable financial support for clinical trial infrastructure, not based on recurrent competitive grant funding models. So, what have we done? We've had 10 meetings. It's been busy. We've had a lot more sub-meetings. We've had 4 subgroups led by very, I suppose, passionate people in different areas who've really put a lot of work into things like contracts, costings, workforce planning, and incentives. And what I mean by incentives is really around looking at how we can change things like R&D tax credits to make it more attractive for companies to perform clinical research in Ireland. I can tell you as a clinician scientist that was an interesting meeting. But also very important. We presented our interim recommendations to Cabinet in October of 2024. There was an enormous amount of work done by the group to get that ready. We got it into the last meeting of the last government, at Cabinet. And I think that was really important because that did allow us to be mentioned in the programme for government. So the interim recommendations were endorsed by Cabinet, and the final recommendations are currently being drafted. And as you know, many of you, that this is not just our work, of course, this is the work that groups like Clinical Trials Ireland and other non-cancer groups have done. It is clearly called out in the programme for government that we will increase clinical trial activity and provide some sort of a better infrastructure for people to participate. And that, of course, does start to address some of the issues around access to more timely access to novel medications. It doesn't fix it, but it's somewhat helpful. Spain has a hugely successful clinical trials portfolio, but still has a very long time period in actually clearing drugs for use outside of clinical trials. So we have to be careful that we don't suggest that this is going to fix that problem completely. Ireland has huge potential. This is work from IQVIA, and where do we want to get to? We're never going to compete with the countries in the top tier here. UK, Spain, Germany, the big China, and the US. And I was talking to Seamus about this one day, and I said, we're never going to be a premiership team, but we can be a really good championship team, and we can be at the top of the second division, and that would be really, really a step forward. And we actually have a lot of the infrastructure due to the work that was done by people from ICORG all the way through to Clinical Trials Ireland to set up those structures in place. And this was a piece of work done looking at, I suppose, the readiness of a country to accept a trial. And obviously we don't have a big population, we're never going to fix that. But we do have a lot of processes in place around ethics, HPRA, and obviously clinical research facilities dotted across the country to facilitate opening these trials. We just need to make the processes more streamlined. So I'm not going to go through these in all detail, but if you think about our ideal state, we would expect that a regulatory approval and clinical trial agreement discussions would obviously almost occur side by side. Obviously, you can't sign your CTA until you've actually got your approval, but they can definitely happen side by side. And we would hope that by regulatory approval, we would have the first patient on study within 42 days. And I think that's really, we had initially said that we would have the study initiated, but initiation visits are great. Let's push it a bit further. Let's get it to the first patient on study, because that's what patients want. That's what patients really value. We might think it's great to get the study open, but we need to push the sites to make sure that we get the patients on study. And then obviously you deliver the trial, and then we move into the real-world data phase, which is obviously really important. These are some of the issues that have come up around the policy, obviously identifying Ireland as a destination, education to public, understanding, and when I mean public, I mean potential patients, but also legislators, CEOs of hospitals, chairmen of hospital boards, explaining that clinical trials are not high-risk ventures. In fact, there hasn't been a single lawsuit for a clinical trial in this country based on negligence. Obviously, then there's other things that I've said there, and the national EHR is a really important issue. But I think ultimately, if we really want this to work, as a health service, we have to identify research output and research activity as a KPI for each region. And the same way that trolleys are counted every day in this health service, if we really want this to work, research has to be considered at the same level of importance. And that's really where government will have to step up. Communication is going to be key, like Evelyn said earlier. We need to develop a research-friendly culture. I've said this before at this meeting. Ireland is a hostile place to do research, whether it's translational research or whether it's clinical research, and we need to change that fact. And the only way I think we do that is we empower patients, and that's, I suppose, where the work that Cancer Trials Ireland have done has been key to that. And we also provide data, and we're working on a patient dashboard in that area. And then there are practical issues that you can see here that I'm going to talk about some of them now. So our interim recommendations, as you know, were highlighted there. And I'm going to go walk through some of the work that's been done on those interim recommendations, some of which I can discuss openly and some of which we're just finalising. We'd hoped to have it ready. I didn't think this would project as well as particularly well, but this is where we're looking at with regards to final recommendations. But we are looking at kind of key enablers, policy issues, and then practical issues. But what we expect is that we will have a list of recommendations that we can present to government similar to a cancer strategy, and they can be ticked off one by one, and we can actually look at how they will be funded properly. I'm going to talk a little bit today just about indemnity and data protection, which I know is an issue for a lot of people in this room, and also some issues around costings. So with regard to data protection, we have had multiple meetings with the Data Protection Commissioner, and it's been a very insightful process, and it's been very educational for us. And I would say that a lot of the issues that we've come across are myths that have been propagated by recurrent whispers. And when we got down to the bottom of it, there's not a whole lot of issues around data protection. And these are our guidance, which will be now published jointly on the NCTOG website, but also the Data Protection Commission. Because one of the things we want is we want clear messaging around data protection. And really, when it comes down to DPIAs, this is very straightforward. You'd be surprised. I'm sure this is really upsetting for people who've spent weeks and months probably interacting with different DPOs at different sites and things like this. But when the sponsor is the data controller, which as many of you know is nearly always the case, there is no need for a DPIA to be assessed at a trial site. And it is the sponsor's responsibility under the GDPR that they undertake a DPIA for their clinical trial activity. And once they submit a statement of compliance, there is no need for that to be that to be reviewed or to be approved by the trial site. And we've worked very hard to make sure that we produce as clear guidance as possible, and we now have to socialise that, and that's the next step forward. In the rare occasion where data protection, or where the sponsor and the trial site, just one kind of piece about this point. Obviously, there are different types of data, but the clinical data that this trial site may be worried about, that's going to be covered under their own individual DPIA anyway, so that doesn't need to be revised. And the Data Protection Commission are very clear on this. And in fairness, Rob is here, but we've done a lot of work with the HRDPN as well, and a lot of this is starting to line up. With regards to when the sponsor and the trial site might be joint controllers, it's obviously up to those two groups to develop a joint data controller agreement. And once that's in place, they would do a joint DPIA, but again, that does not need to be reviewed locally at the sites. So this idea that individual DPIAs have to be reviewed and commented on at local sites, which I know is a cause of major concern for a lot of patients and was really very difficult, does not need to be addressed anymore. We also asked for specific guidance around the health research regulations and the CTR, because this is a major kind of complicating matter for certain people. And this all comes down to the fact that the health research regulations require explicit consent for use of research, for research purposes. But I guess one of the things that's very clear is that explicit consent is not always the legal basis for processing data for health research. And sponsors can use other legal bases, which I'll explain in a minute, to process data. So for example, when we do not need to go back to reconsent patients who've participated in a trial if under the CTR there's a reason to actually go back and check their data, which I know has happened and has caused problems in this room before. So just to give you some kind of vignettes, because this can be difficult, Can a sponsor who's required to obtain explicit consent from a data subject under the HRR when conducting a clinical trial use another basis to process their data? The answer is, of course, yes, and they're in fact obliged to do so. So under the CTR, as you know, the sponsor is obliged to report on safety data and things like that, and it's very clear that they do not need to go back. So if there's a safety signal on a drug, under the CTR, you as a sponsor are absolutely obliged to go back and check that out. You are not confined under the health research regulations, despite the fact that some ethics committees have come back and said that you are. Likewise, with regards to an explicit consent for withdrawing data, or withdrawing consent, there's a difference between withdrawing consent and being anonymous and the right for erasure. And it's very clear in the context of research, if you withdraw consent, all of the data that has been processed before you withdraw consent can still be processed. And these are very clear. When we talked to the Data Protection Commission, it was very clear that these were not particularly difficult things to answer, but they were obviously misinterpretation of what was going on. So with regards to contracts, I think indemnity has come up as a major issue. The work that's been done in the HSE group by Rachel and Anna Terres has been amazing to develop the mandated contract, which obviously is not mandated, we hope it will be at some point. But the issue that keeps coming back is indemnity, and it's interesting when you look at indemnity in Ireland. Again, we've had the State Claims Agency speak to us, and they have no record of any major claims with regard to clinical trial activity. This is not high-risk activity from an indemnity perspective. It's compared to, I would say now, an ex-obstetrician. I'm sure they were delighted I got involved in clinical trials and left obstetrics. But at the moment, as you know, there is a need for indemnity coverage in Ireland to cover the gap between what the CIS covers and what might happen with regards to protocols and long-term effective drugs. And one of the things that seems to be unclear when you talk to sponsors is, what does the CIS cover? So this is what the CIS covers, and they provide us very clearly with what is covered. And there are obviously significant gaps there. So the CIS covers any employee in what's a delegated state authority, which is obviously in most cases hospitals. But it really is clear, and it will cover certain investigator-led trials as well, obviously, but it's really clear that the gap arises in what it does not cover. And it does not automatically cover industry-sponsored trials that occur outside of a public hospital, for want of a better word. It requires proof of negligence, and this is the problem, so you need to cover yourself for that. And then it doesn't help you with regards to any trial design or protocol failures. So what do other countries do? Well, most other countries that are very research active actually have a no-fault compensation process in place for clinical trial activity. This is a very cheap thing to put in place. It's a very easy thing to do. It's basically a non-adversarial approach to what might happen on it with regards to a clinical trial. It's rarely kind of used, and as you know, in the UK, it's not even mandatory, but it's based on ABPI guidelines. And it's really a very straightforward way maybe to fix what is a problem with regards to identifying Ireland as a host for clinical trials. And ultimately, what we need to do is come up with some recommendations around this. These are some of our potential solutions, but we will provide a recommendation around indemnity, which I think will help close off the contract issue, because once the indemnity piece is sorted, I think the contracts are almost completely fit for purpose at present. We're renegotiating a couple of small issues with regards to contracts, but not massive. The final thing I want to talk about is costings, and I'd like to acknowledge Martina Hennessy, who is really an inspirational lady. Many of you will know her as the director of the CRF in Trinity. But Martina has led out a group looking at really costings in Ireland, and again dispelling some myths, and I'm going to show you some of those myths now. And the costings group were really asked to look at what we've done with the interim recommendations. So when they did an international comparison, there's massive variation in how different countries manage costings for clinical trials. Some do it well. So, for example, the UK have a very mandatory approach to it. Probably works for a big country like the UK. Belgium have an entirely different approach. Denmark really don't have an approach, to be honest, which is interesting, considering how good they are globally. But we did a comparative cost analysis looking at, is Ireland more expensive to do a clinical trial than other countries? And in fact, it's not. So one of the issues that came back from the sponsors were, you're really expensive. And we said, we're not sure about that. And the average cost, say, for example, of per patient in Ireland in oncology there, you can see it per visit, is about 840. The average cost is about 1,100 for all trials, and that's bang on the same as Denmark, Belgium, and Germany. And it's about, within the European Union, we rank about 4th out of 16, so we're not off the line at all from that perspective. The single driver of cost in Ireland is staff costing, which we can't deal with, because that's obviously outside our remit with regards to national pay agreements. And that comes down to the fact that we haven't put a proper approach in place for workforce planning. So we have long-term or short-term contracts where we have particularly research nurses working on short-term contracts, and we can't really cost out these things over a long period of time. And we can't really be competitive when we want to apply for studies in the future. So the costing recommendations really are to develop an agreed financial costing template for both commercial and non-commercial trials, and also to develop a centralised approved price schedule. And I know that the NCTO had done some of this work in the past, and this really just needs to be maintained and updated. There's a lot of discussion around the place at the moment in Ireland around hospitals in particular thinking they're going to make loads of money out of research. Those of you in the room know that that's completely a waste of time. But really, to make ourselves in any way competitive, we would suspect that an indirect cost rate of overhead rate of 40% is appropriate at current times. And I think in some of the cancer trials, the overhead rate is less than that, and I think there is options to maybe increase the overhead rate a little bit in cancer trials. And we're really, I suppose, keen that people do not get ripped off with regards to trying to open studies and then they suddenly don't open. And we do feel that a 15% proportion of the cost should be paid at the contract signature stage to protect against that. So ongoing work is almost there. We are working on some ideas around long-term infrastructure. We will have some recommendations about that. I see Simone Walsh is here. She's working on the workforce planning piece of it. And then we're really trying to figure out what Ireland's unique selling point might be. But as coming back to Evelyn's point earlier, how do we future-proof this? How do we make Ireland a destination that can accommodate decentralised trials? How do we bring in AI? How do we make sure that the government understands that without an EHR, this is a complete waste of time? These are the real issues that we need to address. And in fairness to the Minister, she has really stepped up to say that an EHR is her major selling point. So we have to all support that, and that's something we really need. So what would success look like? I suppose a vibrant, lean, I think financially viable clinical trials ecosystem in the country. That's data-driven, using decision-making, data-driven and performance-based, and I think that's key. We need to reward units that perform well, and we need to bring up units that may be struggling. But we need to have clear accountability, and Seamus, in fairness to him, has been preaching the accountability piece for some time. That will allow us to give equitable access and that's consistent for patients and physicians or nurses across the country. It's going to be expensive. It's going to require significant investment from multiple levels of government, not just the Department of Health, Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, Department of Finance, the IDA. This cannot be simply a Department of Health issue, and this will depend obviously on the major focus now will be on the National Life Sciences Strategy. But we will have to disrupt the equilibrium. We will have to ask people to really change, and that's going to be a push. But I think the current equilibrium is probably not working. It might be working to some degree in cancer, but I can tell you outside of cancer it's not. But if we don't do it, we're going to set things back quite significantly. And I think, with innovative therapeutics coming around the corner at such a rapid pace, we're going to find it very difficult. And I can tell you, we will not be able to recruit and retain staff going forward if we don't get this right in the future. And then we won't be able to look after our patients and provide them with, cutting-edge interventions. I'd like to thank all the members of the group. It's been a very enjoyable, sometimes challenging process. We're nearly there. We would expect that we will have recommendations going to government very soon with regards to the current book of estimates. And then we would hope that our final report will be available towards the end of the year. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Donal. That was an excellent presentation. We have time for one or two questions. Two questions. Rory.
Hi, I'm Rory Carey, board of CTI and a former civil servant, though not in the Department of Health or the Department of Public Expenditure. Just that one of the last points you made, the need for cross-government involvement and the involvement of multiple departments. Have you seen or have you heard from the Department of Health much evidence that that's likely to be forthcoming? And secondly, of course, the Minister's rule, and this will be very important, but are there things, organisations like ours, working together? And I think Avril Power very much made the point that we need to work together as a cancer community in this. So those are my two questions.
So yeah, we have a lot of intergovernment discussions. We've met, well, Enterprise Ireland are on the board. I've met numerous people in the IDA, and we've also met people within DFERS and DEET. Really, this will come down to getting the correct recommendations in place for the current book of estimates and then moving forward from there. And in fairness, the Minister has been very supportive to date. She's obviously awaiting our recommendations, but I think if you look at our interim recommendations, they were very clearly endorsed and were brought to government very quickly. So I think there is definitely an appetite in government to do this. I would say that they haven't really come to terms how much it's going to cost. But I would also say that there has been significant investment in infrastructure. So we're actually looking to see, can we use the investment that's there already and add to it? So, of course, we've been working in the background in all those areas.
Janusz Krawczyk from Galway. Thank you. It's excellent work, and I'm really looking forward for implementation. My question is related to the equality of access to for the patients between the country, between the East, West, and other hospital groups. Is this a part of the strategy to try to balance and equalize the access and investments?
Yeah, and that's a challenge, obviously, with the new regions. Some regions are maybe more advanced in their governance setup than others. I think we have to be equitable and practical. So I think we need to be able to open studies across the country, but we also need to be very clear about the fact that some studies will have to open in specific areas, and that's where the community has to come together to work that out. And that's I think why I've said that we need to promote, I suppose, a data-driven, results-based funding model, but also within that model that we're not excluding people, so that we figure out how we can bring up the units that are struggling. Ultimately, we're not going to be able to open every single study in every region using the current model, but I think we need to be very careful that that current model is about to become obsolete, and as we move towards decentralised trials, we need to be set up for that, and I think that's where the equity will come in.
Thanks, Donal. And you also chair the NCCP research group, and a real privilege to be on that, because I think some of these conversations are happening. I know the Clinical Trials Committee is for all disease areas, but selfishly, can I ask about the future of the HSE and cancer? So we have a National Cancer Control Programme at the moment, yeah, nice easy one, and we're moving into regions. And I suppose what we've always asked for is more investment through the HSE, through the hospitals, for staff to work on clinical trials. Because staff throughout the country, particularly if I take Tala, for example, I mean, they're funded through the money that they raise through the trials, and their voluntary hospital is able to navigate that, but HSE hospitals aren't. So that's my question. How's the landscape going to look in cancer over the next 5 years? And is there an appetite to fund people to work in clinical trials within the HSE, whether it's in the regions or whether it's through the NCCP? What do you think?
So there's two issues there. So there's a big piece of work going on at the moment between the HSE and the regions, and we're trying to, between the NCCP and the regions, and we're trying to set up MOUs with each of the regions, and hopefully they'll be signed soon, and that's around the delivery of standard clinical care. That does not, at the moment, include research per se. I think, within our group, a clear recommendation is going to have to be how we staff these units and how we staff them in a way that is, I suppose, equitable and safe, because there's no point in putting loads of people into Hospital A to do clinical trials and suddenly there's nobody to open the clinical trials. But ultimately the hospitals and the regions are going to have to step up and in some way absorb some of these staff. Not all of them maybe, but some of them, so that we have a core group of permanent staff in hospitals to deliver research, clinical trials. That may not be cancer specific. So you may have to you may have a clinical trials office in a hospital that will manage all clinical trials, like a CRF of some sort. And but ultimately, if we don't bring, I suppose, and that's, I suppose, one of the issues with some of the CTRUs, that they have brought those staff into the hospital. But ultimately, if we don't bring those staff into the hospitals, and the hospitals have to step up, and that's my point about if we don't make research activity a proper KPI that the CEO of the hospital has to pay attention to, we're going to run into trouble. And I think that's the key to the whole thing. And, you know, we can do all the fancy stuff around contracts and we can do all this, but if we don't get the staffing piece right, and we can build really nice buildings, but people matter more than buildings. And I think if we get the right, and there are plenty of people out there who want to do this work, but they want to do it in a way that's safe for them, that they have kind of permanency and they have predictability in their job. And if you give them that, they'll do as much work as you want.
That was a great start to the morning. We very much appreciate your insights today, and we're very grateful for all the work and leadership that you've provided in this initiative. It's a very timely, important thing. It will have huge impact. Many
thanks very much,
Donal.
Enjoy your day. Thanks.